Being here today. My name is Triplett. I'm honored and privileged to be here talking to you all about a unique trend from 19th century America, dueling. Now, there are a lot of texts out today that talk about specific duels that were fought throughout American history, as well as biographies on individuals that fought several duels in their lifetime. However, there is no one single text that pinpoints a specific full chronological timeline that tells you when dueling officially started, when did it reach its climax, and when did it officially end in American society. And that's the question that I propose in my research this year is, can that be done? Can we fully establish that full timeline, specifically focusing on the latter portion? Did the tradition of fighting duels in America end at a specific point in time in our history, or did it stick around and change form into a new fighting style? And my argument is basically that the old 19th century duels in the days of Alexander Hamilton evolved after the Civil War into something similar to our Western style gunfights leading up to the 20th century. And my thesis is this, that the tradition of dueling in the United States was not eradicated by the Civil War or the death of the Southern honor culture. Rather, it evolved into a new type of combat consisting of two fighters, but differed in terms of rules, types of fighters, weapons, and motivations for fighting. Now, in terms of historiography, there are two major authors that provide a good framework focusing on the Southern culture that would fuel men in major political positions to fight duels against each other. Specifically, Bertram Wyatt Brown and Joanne Freeman in their works pictured here, Southern Honor and Affairs of Honor. C.A. Harwell Wells is an example of a historian who focuses on an argument stating that the Civil War was the end and the finish line to dueling. After 1865, duels no longer were popular and they no longer existed, period. However, Ryan Chamberlain supports my argument in that he acknowledges existence and presence of duels after the Civil War, but in a different form. Now, in order to understand how duels changed over time, we have to go back and understand its origin story. Where did this tradition itself come from? And we look to early Western Europe, specifically in the Middle Ages, in the times of knights, chivalry, and absolute monarchs. When you would have two knights that would have a dispute between one another, that could eventually escalate into all-out warfare with their war bands as well, which could cause chaos in the nation. So monarchs would impose certain codes of law, or dueling codes, to contain those disputes and prevent that escalation. Now, duels were structured to be fought only between two men of prominent nobility with political power. If you were a member of a minority, if you were a female, you were not allowed to participate in this tradition. If you were attempting to do so, that was seen as a breach of a social boundary, and you would be punished by law for that. But each duel was fought between two men of high political status. There would be a public denunciation of that person's honor, reputation that would fuel this duel to occur, and there would be a public challenge present as well. But the rules of the dueling code have to be enforced at these fights. So you have officials that serve similar to our referees in football games, except they're armed this time. These are called seconds, and you see in this depiction from 1870 of a Middle Ages duel with swords, you see two men standing on the other side of the ring that are watching. They're making sure the knights themselves do not break any of the rules. These were often fought with swords, but by 1700, with the British invention of the flintlock pistol, pistols became predominantly used in Great Britain as well as early America, and which leads us to the climax of dueling in America. When you think of the phrase duels in America, this is what we think of. The time of Alexander Hamilton getting killed by Aaron Burr and singing about it on Broadway, apparently. But this is the peak of dueling. You still see the European style of only white aristocratic men with political power still fighting these. Their names up here are very recognizable. Some examples to us stand out, like founding fathers like Hamilton, prominent political figures like Henry Clay, and future presidents like Andrew Jackson. Like the old knights from Europe, they would fight these to preserve or defend their public reputation and their public statements or values and beliefs that they represent. But at this time, this was illegal. There were state laws throughout the nation that abolished dueling in the states as early as 1799 in Kentucky. Despite that, you have our prominent political figures are the ones breaking the law, fighting this. This is kind of ironic there. So we have to understand why they're fighting these. So defending their reputation is one reason. You could also duel someone to politically elevate yourself in the political hierarchy. Because if you're dueling someone, it's an understanding that you two are of an equal status, if that makes sense. But at this time, the general public, despite duels being illegal, the general public approved of this occurring because after somebody defeats somebody in a duel and they move up in the political hierarchy, it's very likely that you elect somebody that publicly defends themselves and their values into a political office to represent you. You want somebody that's brave, courageous, and has this brave, courageous, heroic demeanor to represent you in some sort of office. These duels were often fought with swords and pistols like the European style. You still see the use of seconds or officials to enforce the dueling codes. These were also fought in private areas that were woods, fields, or farmland, or secluded islands off the Mississippi River. When we move into the Antebellum period, we see a continuation of certain aspects of duels. Specifically, you still see white men with political power still being the only individuals participating. However, this trend is also moving westward. So the term manifest destiny does apply to the dueling tradition. Now, we see two major changes in this era. Number one, public opinion is changing in terms of fueling anti-dueling legislation. In 1838, for example, we see two federal congressmen, Jonathan Silly from Maine and William Graves of Kentucky, fighting a duel in Washington, D.C. because Silly disapproved of the unfair press coverage of Congress during his term. So they fought a duel over that, and Silly was unexpectedly killed while serving his term in office. So he was the first person to be killed in a duel while still serving his term in office. And that outraged the constituency that went through a very intense election to vote him into office. The next year, Henry Clay advocates for and is able to pass an anti-dueling law, with that death fresh on everyone's mind, which outlaws dueling in Washington, D.C. specifically. However, much like the state laws that were already in place throughout the country, that proved to be ineffective. So a second method to combat this dueling culture in the Antebellum period is the establishment of anti-dueling associations, groups of politicians that begin lobbying for and publicly protesting and supporting legislation against duels. They've come up in predominant southern cities like Charleston, South Carolina, New Orleans, and Vicksburg, Mississippi, where Jefferson Davis is one of the founding members of the Anti-Dueling Association. A little fun fact there. Then the Civil War arrives, and we see two changes. You could argue that this is the flashpoint for the dueling culture, not because dueling meets its sudden demise, but we see more changes occurring. So one change is that we see all ranks in the military fighting duels, from your high-ranking generals to lower-ranked unnamed officers in newspaper articles. Also, you see a variation of weapons being used. You're not only seeing men fighting with swords or pistols in the 1860s, you're seeing men change the style, trying to propose men to fight duels with shovels, fish knives, ice cream freezers, small cannons, and lead pipes. Can you imagine Alexander Hamilton fighting a duel with a shovel? That makes me laugh very hard. Sorry, but obviously the anti-dueling movement was put on hold at this time because the focus is on the war. But you see instances where duels are fought over issues with women, prisoners fighting their captors to escape captivity, and political figures still defending their reputations. For example, the treasurer of the Confederacy was accused of embezzling the Confederate treasury in 1864. Now, after the Civil War, that public support that we saw in the Revolutionary era that fueled politicians to duel and make a name for themselves was completely over. The nation saw no need for more excessive or unnecessary bloodshed after a 4-year-long civil war. In his book, Politics, Papers, and the Press, and Pistols, you see Ryan Chamberlain trying to define the fights that occurred between the Hamiltonian-style duels and your 20th century gunfights, and he coins the term rencounters. There's something in the middle, because they are your Western street fights, but you see remnants of traits that you can still see in early American duels. Now, we talked about the public support no longer being here because the anti-dueling laws are now being enforced after the Civil War. So newspaper articles are now, instead of promoting people that fought in duels and trying to gain them more press to be elected into office, they're now describing stories about men being arrested, tried, and convicted for trying to fight in a duel, not necessarily fighting one, just publicly challenging someone to one as well. You see men trying to adapt the fighting style to let it survive and linger just a little bit longer, despite the anti-dueling efforts. So you see men using revolving pistols and changing the weapons. You're seeing these being fought in public places, on street corners, instead of private wooded areas like early American duels as well. And the last example of this is in 1898 in Waco, Texas, when a former Confederate captain and a newspaper editor fight it out in the middle of the street in Waco, and the men, quote, empty their entire revolvers into one another. At this time, the main goal was to kill the other guy. As in early American duels, that was not the main goal. It's for political elevation. It is defending your personal reputation. So in short, my basic argument is you can see a linear relationship between the early American duels in the 19th century and these post-Civil War gunfights and conflicts. And by 1900, these public spectacles of gunfights with revolving pistols are becoming so numerous, the press can find no possible way to keep track of these. It's hard to differentiate whether two men are trying to fight this evolved form of a duel, or they're just two drunk guys shooting each other on the street with pistols. It's hard to tell. But I'm saying that these two fighting styles are not two different styles alone. They are related to one another, and they are of one and